Okay, so now we are live.
Okay.
Okay, so hopefully we work out our technical difficulties with everybody that's watching. But in lieu of that, what we're going to do is just go over a couple of our slide decks as far as our educational pieces, and then that will give everybody something to work from, and we can try to figure out how to do more of an interactive Q&A a little bit later. So what I think people can do is they should be able to type and chat with us. So I hope that basically kind of comes online here. I'm going to open up the chat window to the group chat. I'm going to type hello, everyone. And so hopefully that pops up in everybody's window and people can kind of migrate there, or we should be able to begin to hear them because I've got an earpiece in and I'll just relate the questions that they have. But the first place that really kind of starts is to do this before we end up having that solution would be to go right here, and we're going to let's see, screen share, and we're going to pick our Cat Talk. Cat Talk stands for Cannabis Applications and Technology. It's the way we communicate with our with people in kind of a general sense. It's part of our educational program, and it basically breaks things down into those base level pieces that people need. So the purpose of Cat Talks is one to, of course, inspire conversation, but also to educate and to open up new ideas. So I think if I go right here and switch to this guy, what we're going to find out is that we're going to be talking about why cannabis is a medicine, and kind of walking through the important points that are that we need to consider when we're addressing cannabis as an intentional therapeutic. The very first thing that we need to do is just really pose whether or not cannabis even is a medicine, right? Because if it was a medicine, if it was medicinal, then it should perform like one, and therefore our expectations of it should be that it is. And this is the fundamental problem with cannabis as a therapeutic. Most people don't expect results. They hope that results will hit them. And since cannabis is a thing, is a set of molecules, represents a science, then we should be expecting that it's ultimately going to create an end result. And if that end result is medicinal, then it should be medicinal. It should not be a 1 in 50,000 of chance, or it should be reproducible, it should be controllable, it should be beneficial, and it should be done that way intentionally. So if cannabis is a medicinal, then how is it a medicinal, and why, and what are the actions that it takes? That's the fundamental question that the MX project asks. The purpose of this is to empower patients to expect a new level of performance, to expect a new level of results, because if cannabis is medicine, and if it is the correct medicine or medicinal, then it is something that should be able to provide that. And if it's not, that means the supply chain that's bringing you that cannabis is not functioning correctly. And there's a lot to that supply chain, but this is why you should expect it. So the very first thing we have to start off with is understanding is that the word medicine is really just a trademark. It's the same reason using the word medicine, the reason why we can't use the word medicine, and we will never be able to use the word medicine, is because the word medicine is basically owned by a company, that FDA company. And just like we couldn't build a car that looks exactly like a Corvette and call it a Corvette, General Motors would come in and it would say, no, you can't call that car a Corvette. So medicine is really a trademark. It's a term. It's not a thing. It's a term or a label or a legal designation of meeting a level of processes that allows people to make claims, but it doesn't necessarily mean what it is. So my background's in organic synthetic chemistry, and so we were always making the molecules that were before we even worried about that was going to be called medicine. We were working in that functional, that rational development area. And so the very first thing I guess to understand is that medicine is a trademark. It's not really a thing. But behind that, what are things that even get that designation? Well, ultimately things that are small, biologically active, and molecules end up getting even the chance to become a medicine or be termed as medicine. So we throw out the fact that we don't care about the term. The term will never be available to us anyway. Ultimately, what we're talking about is small biologically active molecules. And what does that mean? Well, proteins are huge. Medicines are often small biologically active molecules. If you were studying small biologically active molecules, you'd be studying either poisons most likely, or you'd be studying medicines, or some version of the two. The cannabinoids that are inside, or the components of cannabis that are inside there, are interesting because they don't tend to have that lethality towards them. So one of the things that we should be looking at is, are we expecting enough from cannabis? Because if it doesn't have a lethality, if it doesn't have the ability to impact brain chemistry sensitization, then, or sensitivity, then why aren't we exploring the upside instead of basically just continuing to push as an industry that it's just safer than alcohol? Again, ping pong balls are safer than alcohol, but we're not in a giant conflict over ping pong balls. So small biologically active molecules get the job done, and they do that through a process that's called structure-activity relationships. And that is what a medicinal is. A medicinal action is basically a small biologically active molecule of a particular shape, because each one of these molecules takes up space, and then they're stacked together. These atoms are stacked together within this molecule that creates a shape. And then there is a receptor that is a complementary shape, or the opposite, that allows them to interact with the systems in the body. So the first question is cannabis medicinal? Well, every research paper, just the facts of cannabis say that it clearly is an entire giant cohort of small medicinally active molecules that all provide some level of structure-activity relationship with major receptor systems in the body. So the medicinal action for cannabis is very clear, very documented, very quantifiable. It is not a mystery. So our expectation should be that we should be able to have the highest expectations of cannabis, because not only is it perform at the base sense, it actually has what we're going to get into, some helpers through the endocannabinoid system, which is one of the major players in regulation of a good deal of our neural and our immune systems, as well as other systems. Those endocannabinoid receptors are shaped. They have the ability to receive ligands anywhere between a couple to 5 carbon lengths. And when we're talking about it at this level, a lot of times what I'll just explain is that it kind of reminds you, obviously, of a telephone cord of when we had the one telephone, and your mom or somebody smart would put a pencil in it, and that pencil would then be available for somebody to take notes. Those little ligands act kind of like if you were to try to take a pearl necklace and stretch it out. Those would be, you also could drop those into the telephone cord. And so by that interaction, that structure-activity relationship, meaning that they have to be able to fit in there, and then if they can fit in there, can they get far enough along? Ultimately, this is how these cannabinoids, or the cannabis small medicinally active molecules, are interfacing with the receptors in our system. These receptors are highly important, but really at this point, what we just need to understand, even with physicians, is that this actually happens, right? So we have these molecules that have specific shapes, specific vibrational frequencies, and they're translating those energies into a receptor system that is designed for them. And that structure activity relationship, that affinity for the receptor is actually happening. That is a little weird, because the entire premise that cannabis is not useful must run on the fact that this doesn't happen, except for that it does, and it happens at an almost specialty level. And so that's the very first thing, is that when people are talking about cannabis, you just need to start laying down the facts, because most of the conversation, or most of the argument, goes away as you just start laying out these pieces. So cannabis is a small medicinally active molecule. It performs a structure activity relationship with a specialized set of receptors, which are major regulators in the human systems. These are just basic facts, and this means that we're building a case that cannabis should perform like medicines. More importantly, this endocannabinoid system suggests that maybe cannabinoids are getting more help than anything else is getting, because there are very few systems that are designed to interface with medicinal molecules. Yet the endocannabinoid system is designed only to interact with those, and it is a major system in the body. And so our expectations would be that if you brought a medicine in that had no help, what could it do? Versus you were to bring in a medicinal that has all the help in the world, obviously our expectations can be much higher when you know that you have that helping system. So as we break this down, they don't look like this. We just use this particular slide to be able to just demonstrate kind of square hole, square pegs, round hole, round peg. Is that there are three major systems or three major classifications in the endocannabinoid system. Again, we're just kind of keeping things really basic. That's why you have a circle and a pentagon and a square with a star, right? I mean, this is not a very sophisticated way of looking at this, but it is important to understand that ultimately in this endocannabinoid system, there are these receptors. These are these receptors that have a shape to them. And the reason why certain cannabinoids can get an interface with one and can't with another ultimately is designed areas based on these shapes and the geometry of these molecules. So this is just kind of suggesting that there are different geometries with these receptor systems. But this also plays into the fact that if you are going to tackle or you're going to address cannabis into a system, then wouldn't it make sense that you knew that molecule would interface with that system? One of the ways and one of the reasons that medicine can even work is because it is physically present at the event that it needs to be in order for it to influence some sort of process. Right? So you have to physically get to your destination, and then once you're there, you have to be able to physically interact with that issue, and then that issue that you're interacting with has to have some sort of signaling or some sort of resultant event that is due to that medicine. That's how it works, right? Those are very basic things, but again, these are important pieces to put there because cannabinoids demonstrate that when we achieve saturated effects. So like if there's any question on whether they're getting there, you just can turn to somebody who's high and be like, so did it make it? Yeah, it made it, right? That's why they're stuck playing the Xbox for $400. Not that useful, but the fact is that it is demonstrating that they're getting to these receptors and they get there quickly. So the fact is that they are a low modulating, non-persistent palliative, but they are not, we don't have to wait very long to be able to do these effects. That's another interesting thing about cannabis we'll get into a little bit later. But when we are trying to identify cannabinoids that are ultimately going to provide some intentional benefit, and we're dealing with a brain system, we either need to be coming through the front door or we need to be coming through a tertiary back door or a back series of back doors. But we also, just because you show up, right, just like I can make it into the living room, doesn't necessarily mean that everything is solved. Because if you have a kitchen fire, yeah, I could get in the house. I could get in through the front door, for example, in the CB1. I open the door, I'm in. But if I don't have the right tools and can't navigate into the kitchen, then I either have to have a friend I could call that can come in the back door, or I'm actually useless in this particular problem. So when we're selecting profiles, we know that we're selecting them based on their interaction with these major systems, and we're saying, look, if the endocannabinoid system is capable of regulating this particular issue, then our tools need to be able to get there and be useful and be at the and have the ability to turn it off. So again, if we've got a house fire, so we can get in there, we've got a wrench, we can turn on the water. But if the water isn't on at the street, then the resultant response is not satisfactory and nothing happens. We talk about this kind of stuff quite a bit. And I get a lot of people who ultimately kind of say, yeah, we already know this. But then they go and they do things like recommend these really weird strain names that are super popular, but they don't actually do anything and physically have no way of being able to accomplish this very basic foundational strategy / tactical deployment of the medicinal. It's frustrating because there's lots of people who are out here on the Facebook chats talking about these things, but then when it comes to the application of their medicine, there's nothing there. And I would argue that's exactly why their medicine works a little while, then all of a sudden it stops working, or one person works for one person, but they can't turn to somebody else and immediately help them. There's no way to really document, right? One of the reasons why we're running in a fully documented process is because we're using these foundational pieces. And I think if people want to get the similar performance of what we're doing, then they would use these similar pieces too, because this is what's called rational drug design. There's a rational approach to why we're doing things, where it's a reverse engineering. If I know I have to go through the CB1 to get to a neural system, or the CB2, or I need to go through both, or there's some tertiary process that I want to, then I have to basically know that we can get there. Now, obviously, trying to cram 50 people through the front door also becomes an issue, or what we might call receptor competition. So as we're doing this, this is extremely important. This slide seems so simple, but it's so important to understand is that there is a rationale behind why cannabis can function, and that these cannabinoids can function directly from the plant, right? We don't have to do much. It's not even like we were having a conversation about Taxol a couple of days ago. That's still in the semi-synthetic route, right? We still have to keep it going in order to be able to get to what we need. But in this particular case, we're talking about a minor treatment that the body is capable of doing, or we can pre-activate through mechanical process. And ultimately, we end up being able to address these things directly, one-to-one. And so this is probably one of the most important aspects that completely gets overlooked. Everybody uses and points to the endocannabinoid system and these receptors as proof why marijuana should work, but they don't use it, and therefore marijuana doesn't work. And it's not because the cannabis wasn't capable. It's because everybody forgot that it's a tool, or too many people forget that it's a tool, and the fact that these tools go certain places, and this is the basis for rational applications of cannabis, which means that our expectations should be rational, and that means they should be exceptionally high. Pardon the pun. Why is that? Okay, so it's because we have these shapes, right? So this is a particular cannabinoid that's basically listed out, and there's different pieces to it. The very first part is why are we having trouble with cannabinoid therapies? Well, basically because the majority of the people who reference cannabis reference the wrong end. They reference, if this was a key, if you could kind of imagine that there was a stick and then a fob, the yellow circle is a fob, and the ligand there is the key part of your key, the toothed part of your key. And let's just call that a major motor corporation's key, like Hyundai. No, we got to pick something that we can't get sued over, but pick something, right? So there's a lot of them, like a Mervolvo. And so if this was a Mervolvo key, then the majority of the cannabis world is basically saying, well, the Mervolvo key is the most important aspect to starting a Mervolvo. But really, it's not, because if we have the Mervolvo fob to prove that we have the Mervolvo key, and we walk onto the lot, the expectations that if we were standard cannabis folks, we would assume that that's all we need. We could go out and take any Mervolvo out what we wanted, joyride, because we've got the key. We've got 100% Mervolvo. No, none of the keys are going to work, because we're basically quantifying the Mervolvo key by the fob, like THC or CBD, and those are really family names. Like the Mervolvo is a family name because they can have a PUV and a Swaggin. I don't know. I'm stretching here. The point being is the fact is that the fob of the key is less important. This is also pre-electronic key that Mervolvo has developed. But back in the day when you needed to physically interface with the car to start it, the fact is that the fob was less important. In fact, arguably not important at all, because we could change the fob out all we wanted. When it comes to these molecules, these small medicinally active molecules that participate in a structure-activity relationship with receptor systems that they have an affinity for, the vibrational and geometry is basically being provided, vibrational energy and the geometry is being provided by the fob. But the actual interface with the receptor is this ligand part, this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and how far you can reach in there and how far you can transfer energy and then the relationship. Again, these are not super simple, but the fact is that nature is not necessarily super complex. It's just real. And so all we have to do is just address these molecules for what they actually are. So there's a jiggle aspect to them that changes the way they translate energy, or the energy they translate to the receptor, and then their ability to interact with the receptor is simply based on that ligand. And again, it is not quite that simple, but it's good enough for right now. And the fact is, if you even got this far with the majority of physicians, at least when we get this far with the majority of physicians, they're on board. They're like, we've just opened the possibilities for them to be able to engage. Light bulb. Yes, exactly. And there are many different families. So there are many of these configurations that change with that ligand length. And so what we need to understand is that they're not just one. So that there are not just one THC or one CBD, or the fact that THCA is somehow some radically different. It's just a precursor. And so we just have to step back and say, okay, look, let's just treat these things, these medicinally active molecules, for exactly what they are. And we don't have to get super fancy, but it is complicated. So, I mean, it's like trying to have a conversation in my mind, like with exceptionally functional antioxidants. And if you're really going to sit down and have a conversation beyond the Facebook post of, drink green juices, if you were going to have somebody that you cared about, and you knew that one of the things that you needed to add to their diet was an effective antioxidant supplements, well, we wouldn't all of a sudden be trying to jam an entire handful of vitamin E fish oil down their throat, because one, we know that it doesn't work. Two, there are some things and components in vitamin E that are important for the actual uptake, and the fact that it's actually more important that vitamin E fish tablets are convenient. But what people really need is that diversity of those antioxidants. And realistically, if we had spent enough time with them, we'd probably find out that they needed a small emphasis in certain ones, but really we weren't trying to bombard their body. In fact, the body would say, when we get too much, we just kick it out the back door. With cannabinoids, the body obviously tries to process them, and ultimately I think you hit and you do some things that look like saturation. But from our findings, which is not really going to go over here today because it's more general education, is that most people are taking far too much. Again, you need that matched profile, but the fact is that people are forgetting that the end result is to get better rather than to take cannabis. Now, when you bring that up to somebody, what they're saying is, of course, that's right. I'm not trying to but the entire support community is really built around take cannabis, take cannabis, take cannabis. And then we bring a Western mindset, which is more is better, more, to a natural substance where more is never better, right? There's no cases where eating all the steak in the world makes you better, or eating all the oats in the world makes you better, right? But Western belief is more horsepower, more, okay, well, great. We just need to remember that cannabis and cannabinoids are coming from a naturally derived source, and they just didn't get around to all the marketing side. So this idea that there's only one or two things and we want to maximize those is foolish. And there are some things out there like these ratios. There are some things out there like I saw this one thing that was out there called the entourage effect. And it was like, oh, that sounds great, until they started describing it. And it's like, it's another gimmick. Here's the deal. Cannabis is not a gimmick. We just treat it for what it is. We come up with rational strategies, and that allows us to be able to formulate a process to execute against. And when you do that, I believe that you basically realize the most therapeutic benefit of those profiles that are capable of delivering. And from there, you need a project, which is why we started ours, to identify which profile is the most effective for the issue that you're doing. And that's what this allows you to do. These are the baby steps that you need to do to base that foundation, because if our expectations are super low, then everybody should just get ripped. Just smoke that weed. Burn the dagga, right? Is that the word, dagga? Right? That's
no idea.
Okay. But the point being is that that's what most people are not looking for from cannabis right now. Marlboro and all of the different large tobacco companies, they're going to take cannabis and turn it into what everybody treats it today. We have to basically protect what it's capable of doing, because if it's capable of doing very significant benefit, providing specific benefit to patients, we need to understand this complexity, because if it can do it, then it's the safest material in the world to do it. And we don't have to make claims. We just have to demonstrate results. So this ultimately begins into understandings that most people are looking at it from the fob, but I think we should basically begin to look at cannabis by its functionality. And so this is a vibration versus reach or depth. This is kind of what we use at a very, very basic level to just show people how we evaluate cannabinoids. And the fact is that there's ultimately some number of vibrational states that are present in those families of cannabinoids. Those fobs can either be one version of a fob, two versions of a fob, three versions of fob, and what they actually are. Obviously, that's important, but at this point, each one either has their one vibration, two vibration, three vibration. Think of it like guitars. Obviously, the vibrational energy out of a nylon string guitar, if you're going to play like a G chord, is going to sound different than the G chord coming off a steel string versus a Fender with the Tex-Mex double wrap single. Yeah, exactly. They are going to be different, but the fact is that each one of those guitars is going to have X number of vibrational aspects. And then, so that's the vibration. So we're not necessarily at this point so much cared that a steel string guitar is vibrating versus with a G chord versus a electric guitar is vibrating with a G chord. It's just the fact that they may have multiple chords that they can play. And in this particular case, they can play up to about 4 vibrational states, but for the most part, 3. They have 3 power chords. And then how that's translated into the receptor, and then of course the receptor has to have the ability to do that, to be able to receive those energies. And so that's important. And that's probably, I would argue, way more important than most people give credit for it. This is the beginnings of understanding how, when we're taking these cannabinoids, we kind of want to place them on the board. We basically change or write in whatever family that we have, and we start placing the cannabinoids on this board, and we'd see that we have, 2 C1s at the first vibrational state, and then 2 C2s, 2 C3s, 2 C4s, 2 C5s in the first vibrational state. What does that mean? That means that there are 10 cannabinoids that are available in that first vibrational state. And then we might look and we say, oh, there's only one cannabinoid available in that particular family at the second vibrational state, and there's also 5 versions of it. So we might have in the vibrational state 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, and 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. And then what we might find out is, oh, did you know that basically those two are kind of the same? And so ultimately, when they interface with the human, the 2 versions become 1 version. And so what we would then be talking about is, oh, functionally we have 5 in the vibrational state and 5 in this first vibrational state. And that's the beginnings of starting to lay these things out. So to save a little bit of time, we will have an entire class on that particular aspect later. But let's go here. So I'm going to stop switching. And whoop, we have 2 viewers. Yay. Okay. So we hopefully people are getting kind of the gist of this, and then it will be recorded. We just had a little bit of technical difficulty, I think, figuring out how to get people into this. Get people into this. So do we want to see, let's see, before I go on, I'm going to okay, the next piece here.
Amy says she can't see the chat, but she has a question.
Oh, great. I'd be happy to do her question. And
she wants me to ask you something.
Okay. Sweet. Oh, 1 viewer.
Uh-oh.
I hope I didn't kick them off. We're not done, by the way.
We're not done.
No. Which is, I wonder how you can, there's like a, so all the way up, let's see, I guess it would be like all the way up there, maybe. I think that's how it works. Or it's all the way up over here is a chat box. And that's how you get, I guess it would probably be right there because we're looking at our own thing, but it's right there. That's pretty cool. Very advanced.
Amy wants to know, does this vibrational account take into effects current pharmaceutical biological process?
So yes, because that's what they do. Molecules vibrate, and they vibrate. So like if you just like you were saying, like a cord is vibrating. So in order for it to be a molecule, it has to be comprised of atoms, and atoms vibrate. When we share electrons with them, we kind of tie strings to them, and so they translate their energy to each other, and then it's like a chord, right? So you can get, because it's like, how do you get a sad feeling from a chord in a blues song, right, versus a terse sound? So it's those combinations together that ultimately are working and stimulating the receptor systems that then drives the biological response.
She says, by that, I mean, we hear a lot about the P450 cytochrome interaction of metabolism between cannabis and building toxic level of farms.
So that has to do with that. So that has to do with a lot larger subject, and that the resultant action. So we have to step all the way back. Like we're stepping at a very high level at this point. So one of the end results of a successful application of cannabinoids is that systems are returning to homeostasis. That's not the only thing that's going on, but what I would just would be is that it's described as that when those systems are returning to homeostasis, one of the things that we see and have seen in many cases, is that the pharmaceutical effectiveness seems to go up. The issue then is that they may be taking the wrong levels.
That's why parents always cut their drugs.
Not always, but one of the reasons what we say when we're participating in a cannabis therapy investigation, that they should be in direct and active contact with their physician, because there are certain drugs, be really super careful how we explain this, because this is just things that have happened in the past, but that certain pharma drugs, when they become too effective, can damage someone because they are too effective. And that could be, especially when those drugs are regulating the levels of something, and they then over effectively regulate that thing, and it pushes it into a dangerous area. But it is due to medicinal action. So is that acceptable? Is that what she's asking about? Because we're talking about basically taking a system that's broken, making it less broken, and now what you're giving it is basically too much and starts to push things over the edge because you needed so much to maintain, or they were ineffective, and now that there are basically less roadblocks in the way, what you thought was a small pressure is really a bulldozer.
Does that help, Amy?
So let's get into that, because that's actually the next piece. Is she cool? Okay. Well, I guess we can't hear her. So, okay. So we're going to go into the next one here, guys, and that is screen share. Oh, more people. All right. Sweet. Let's go into the next piece. Share. So again, our Cat Talk series, cannabis applications and technologies, and what we're trying to do is stimulate these exact questions. So that is awesome that Amy went there. I like these questions. So let's get to, okay, so we're going to do our screen share again. And this one is performance cannabis. And this, I want to get to the beginnings of how we help, it's not unlock, because really it's the cannabinoids have been here the entire time. We've just been ignoring them as a group of people, a group of scientists. I don't know, but the fact is that we've been ignoring them. They've been here longer than science has been here for the most part. And so I think it's our fault that we are so bad at deploying them. So let's talk about how maybe we might be able to deploy them better. And so there are many processes that are designed by different groups of technical groups when everything is on the line, when things are extremely important, and that failure is, although it's an option, would be detrimental. There is a process that technologists and technology people have come up with, and we've just basically borrowed it for the medicinal application of cannabis. But I would argue that this would be the medicinal application of anything medicinal, because it is an iterative, learning, intelligent, rational approach to the application of a solution to a problem when you don't know necessarily if it's going to work, but you have an enormous amount of data to suggest that it should work. And now what we need to do is validate it in a safe and most effective way. So the word that is used across all different technologies, including business, is lean. The idea is that we're going to eliminate all the junk that doesn't matter. This is definitely like the key role of an engineer. So chemical engineering, but we love this kind of stuff too, is that basically we're trying to eliminate all the extraneous junk and just get down to the problem at hand. Obviously, there's an art to eliminating extraneous junk because our assumptions that is extraneous, so we don't necessarily need to, bowl in a china shop. But the idea is that lean development of anything ultimately starts off with the best assumptions, the best scientific assumptions that we can make, and then deploy that in a learning mode, in a reactive, intelligent mode, where we iterate until we have the best solution. The reason why this works wonderfully with cannabinoids therapies and cannabis as a possible therapeutic is that we are investigating the upside, and that what we have found is that cannabinoid therapy is so effective that the amounts that you're using are mind-blowingly low when you come from a cannabis background. They're the exact amount if you come from a scientific background. But if you come from that traditional cannabis background, I think what people are kind of surprised is that we're using 1 million or more times less than what they're using and getting the results they can't get. And again, that was the 50 people trying to go through the front door problem. And I believe that's the issue. Of course, if you end up having 6 million people rush your house, you'll have a big problem. And that's really what's going on, not just 50 people through the front door. So the lean medicine canvas is what we call this. And the very first thing is that we need to understand, why are we even doing what we're doing? And so it starts out with some of these models. But again, as you're explaining this to somebody, you remove the mystery of marijuana, right? So marijuana moves from being a miracle in the making, something that you hope will happen, to a therapy that you have high expectations of. And now it's really left to the intelligence of your program and your science that ultimately drive the outcome. And that's exactly where you want medicine to be. You want medicine to be as effective as possible, where you're using the right base materials and you are letting intelligent people making intelligent decisions that have constant feedback to iterate quickly to an acceptable thing. And that's why we have that 30, 60, and 90-day program, is because we took this much larger program and said, let's break this down so people can even understand whether or not cannabis is even an option. Because most refractory patients, most people who are looking for help, don't have the time to mess with stuff that's clearly not going to help them. What this means is that we need a goal. That goal comes from a patient's or a person's health history, their expectations, and then the ranking of their issues. So when people come and work with our project, we'll usually ask for all of their medical records, and we will investigate them and rank their issues with the patient. So if somebody comes to us with an epilepsy issue, or somebody comes to us with an Alzheimer's issue, or somebody comes to us with an oncology issue, or somebody comes to us with a degenerative issue, or whatever that is, there may be 10 things that they're dealing with. Often patients are complicated. So it would make sense that we do have a complicated set of things that we're trying to deal with. More importantly, what we know is that we can narrow those down for the sake of identifying whether or not cannabis is even an option. And we know that is kind of like taking what we call it big brush strokes. So ultimately, what we're looking for with cannabis is 85% reduction or 85% mitigation, and often a reduction in the symptomology or level of issue, or nothing. Our project has never really seen a 25 or a 15 or a 50% mitigation. So if cannabis seems to be effective, it's got all this help in the endocannabinoid system. It's got this giant regulatory process. It's got all kinds of things going for it. And it just seems to have translated in the last 6 years that when cannabis is effective, it's clearly effective. Well, that means we can basically put a goal up there and develop a strategy to intentionally achieve that, and then come together with a set of tactics or medicinal tactics or things that you do. Like, this is starting to sound very military, but the point being is we're going to have an overall strategy that's going to be driving what we're doing because of the goal that we're trying to achieve. We're going to deploy very specific therapeutic or clinical tools or protocol to be able to do that. And then we're going to have very, very robust and evidence-based metrics that demonstrate that, in fact, we're doing that, making that direction. And then ultimately, the marijuana or the cannabinoid profile that you pick is just the result of this, which this is the exact opposite that I see. Most people are trying to go to some cheeseball named strain and then push that on every single person, right? Maybe one of the reasons why it only works 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000 is simply because it would be like trying to go to every single problem that you have with a screwdriver, assuming that's all you need. And instead of saying, hey, we have this entire giant tool set, and we can have everything from, soft metal to hard metal to woodworking tools to sandpaper so what problem do you have? I have this giant repository of every tool known to man back here. Why don't we talk about your problem first? And then is there anything about your problem that we have to take into account? Because, like, for example, if you don't want to do something, or we have to, for example, we want us to build a swimming pool, but we have to walk across your flower garden, our solutions is going to look very different than if we could just back a tractor up and start digging. And so ultimately, as we're doing this, the fact is that the tools become the end result, or they're basically the pieces that fall out after we set this goals process up, because that allows us to basically unveil the lean medicine canvas. And the lean medicine canvas allows us to be able to say, okay, not only is this not a miracle, this is a process that we can walk you through, then dry run you through, and then have it happen. So this is repeatable, evidence-based, completely transparent, and we get to practice before we actually do this. This does require education. So when people come, we basically spend between 3 and however many days until they feel comfortable to the level of like a nurse administering a therapy to understand why, how, and what the steps are going to be. The reason is because this is not a miracle. It's actually science at work, right? It is just simply application of those small medicinally active molecules that have affinity or a desire to bind with these specific receptors in these very specific systems that either are capable of helping regulate the issue or are not capable of helping regulate the issue. It is just a small, slow walk towards a solution. And what you find is you can get further taking small steps, course correcting as you go. You'll get somewhere where you want to go faster than you are wishing you can jump 1,000 feet at a time. And that's interesting, because if cannabis is capable of being a medicinal, then it should perform like this. And it clearly does in the cases where the endocannabinoid system is involved in these issues at a high level. So the very first thing is that we basically start in the center. It's important to understand these patient issues. So people will come and they'll say, okay, we have these issues. Please send us your records. They'll send us their records, and we start digging. Because ultimately, a lot of their symptomology, a lot of their diagnosis, sometimes it's what we really need to do is take whatever their label is. About 30% of the time, it seems, just plus or minus, it's totally a number pulled out of my rear end. But that people's issues are actually not their issue. It's more like they have the spectrum disorder. We use it kind of as around here to kind of explain. Sometimes people come to us with epilepsy that actually have an inflammation issue. And we'll get into why that is. But the fact is that they really just have epilepsy spectrum disorder, which, of course, when you're talking to most epilepsy patients, as well as most patients in general, these labels are really not that useful for them, other than to be able to know what foundation to be part of, right? So the fact is that we want to take their symptomology, but the other part is that we found is that cannabis is really bad at treating symptoms, partly because of the endocannabinoid system. It doesn't work on that superficial level. It works behind the scenes down at the root cause level, at regulating the pathways. So no joke that basically if you want to be high and hurt, then you can be high and hurt. But you didn't stop hurting. Whereas if you correct a profile that has the ability to address inflammation on 1 to 3 levels, then you don't have that inflammation because you're regulating that process, or the processes, or the pathways, depending on what it is. But the idea is that the patient issues we put in this, and we can put this right on the wall. In fact, I've got one behind us that's for something else. And you just basically stick and start constructing this canvas with your patient, with your client, where you basically put down their issues. The other thing is that often the refractory patients are dealing with a lot of therapeutics, and they also maybe not be able to handle certain things because of the processes that they have gone through previous. And so we need to respect that. But the other thing is that in some cases, these refractory patients also have achieved some level of mitigation, right? They've achieved some level of relief from these more traditional approaches. We obviously do not want to go backwards on that. So that kind of takes us all the way back to the question that Amy just brought up, which was ultimately tied to this is what happens when pharma becomes toxic. Well, the very first thing is that there are lethal doses associated with pretty much every pharma, so they all become toxic. But the fact is that sometimes in this process, we will achieve homeostasis in other systems that allows things to become more effective. And so these are important issues, what we call mitigated issues. This is where we would be breaking people down into these concerns, because we want to know that there is a system somewhere through their physician to re-regulate the application of those pharmas. Because if you start achieving hyper effective, right, because wherever they come in is a baseline, so above that hyper effective mitigation, then you want to address that. You may have to address the backside of that with their pharma regimen. Important.
Amy has another question related to what you're saying right now, so I want to jump in. She says, I want to know how these drug interactions affect building the therapy profile, since many have to be very slowly tapered, more than 6 months.
Okay, Amy asks great questions.
She does ask good questions.
Okay, so there's a whole bunch of issues in here, to include when you are slowly tapering, again, under the supervision of your physician, right? But the other aspect is that there is an HPA downregulation that ultimately disconnects some patients from the actual realities of this tapering. Again, when you are achieving these systems, what the reduction in the pharma programs is important to respect. But the other part is that this downregulation of the hypothalamus, pituitary adrenal system separates people from the reality. It's one of the reasons. So like on the funny side, it's one of the reasons why people get really sweet ideas when they're high. On another side, it's one of the reasons why cannabinoid therapy can be so effective, and when it demonstrates its ability to be effective in helping people with addiction issues, because those addiction issues are disconnected from them, right? You stop, they're still there. they're still there. It's also one of the reasons why you can't really, you have to have more of a third-party assessment of cannabinoid therapies, because your patients sometimes will feel better than they actually are. Like somebody who has like hypersensitivity to pain and they're high and they say, "Do you hurt?" Like, "No, I don't hurt." And you touch their arm and you still do hurt. I guess so, man. But that was mean. You shouldn't have done that. Okay, well, but you still hurt. So ultimately, that downregulation ultimately creates the opportunity to be able to assist the augmentation to their pharmacy regimen. She's probably asking a very specific question about herself or a patient that she knows. The problem is that we can't give medical advice, so I have to keep this answer pretty general. I'm just saying is that there are several systems involved, and I have a slide that basically we go through that. It's a kind of a building block slide that basically shows all the different actions or activities that we can expect and the good and bad side of those things. But one of them absolutely has to do this, and maybe we just call her and have a conversation more directly to that. But ultimately, when you put things, so when things are less broken, when things are achieving more homeostasis, as they are, then obviously they may need less assistance from medicine in general, to include cannabinoids, right? Secondly, there is a downregulation of the systems that keep you connected to the negative effects of, or effects associated with withdrawal of things. And so there is a disconnecting from that issue. And so sometimes that makes things a little bit easier for patients when that's the case. But I think she's asking more along the lines of why toxicity appears. In my experience, she's talking about very specific drugs. And the way that you address that is full communication with a physician about what happens if, pharma 1, pharma 2, or pharma 3, we start seeing results 1, 2, or 3. What are we going to do? And that would be a communication that we would have that would come in the center part as far as this digging through we want to identify what those are.
Right.
Not all drugs do that. So that's why this, I just have a feeling that she's asking very specifically about one particular, or maybe two particular type of treatments. And so we should probably just have that conversation with her. But it's there, and it's a great question. The problem, though, is that the patient issue is often symptoms, right? There are root causes that are basically behind those symptoms. And this is actually where cannabis becomes extremely exciting, because some of the efficacy data seems to be able to go from one condition to another. For example, sometimes information that is used with some of our MS patients is exceptionally functional with our epilepsy or our autism or our anybody who has a neurodegenerative disease. Sometimes there are some root causes that are in there that are great, because the efficacy data coming from them suggests that they share a root cause manifested through pathway out into different symptomology and then out to different diagnosis, but it all comes back to more singular root causes. So what we want to do is we want to go then and go to that box to the right there and say, our patient issues are going to get translated into root cause. We're going to be respectful of any therapeutic requirements or any mitigated issues that we either need to maintain or that we need to respect. And then ultimately in that root cause, we can change our ability to access or interface with that root cause based on the prescriptions or procedures they're doing. Again, Amy's question is humongous. But so ultimately, she's pretty much just asking about this entire canvas. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what we then translate is that into that root cause, we then take into account anything that the patient is having to do or has been recommended to do by the physician that would impact our ability to address that root cause. That allows us to basically create an objective set of metrics. And those metrics would be not anecdotal at all, zero anecdote. This project does not run on anecdote. No project should run on anecdote, because ultimately, if cannabis is a therapy, it should be able to run in that objective metrics area. But we do collect clinical information to be able to prepare the patient for their objective evaluation. So, whether that be, EEG or MRI or something where we can basically document the outcome in a objective, transparent, evidence-based, nobody can argue with it. And then they want to know, what did you do? Well, what we did is we deployed this process. So those metrics there. Of course, we'd also need the baseline information because we have to have comparison to be able to do that, to be able to show a level of mitigation.
Before and after.
The before and after. And so ultimately, so now we've got this, we have the issues, we have our root cause, we have our objectives, and then we start digging further in the associated pathways. And sometimes there are other co-issues that are basically either exasperated or involved in that process that we have to take into account. That process, that basically we're kind of working to the left here, ultimately starts to develop a clinical strategy. And so we have kind of three major clinical strategies that we deploy, but we'll talk about those a little bit later. But those are going to drive our entire approach to our patient. It's based on all of the information. So I guess our clinical strategy is not driving our approach to our patient. Our patient is driving our approach to our patient, but we're going to translate it through a high-level clinical strategy. Once we do that, we now then can go back and say, okay, look, patient, there's one of a couple things. One, are you going to be able to take this as a pill? Because some patients with feeding tubes can't do that. Is this patient only going to medicate through a vaporizer? That's just what they do. They're not going to do anything else. They don't want to take pills. There are patients who have said that's what they want. There have been patients who don't care. The point being is that there are applications of routes that come to this. That basically we need to make sure that our program is respectful on just their aspects of their life. But once we have that, we can then turn to our data set, which is derived from a completely different process, a completely different clinical process that allows us to be able to have a data set that we've been working on and everybody should be working on of profiles. And you'll notice that I have not used strain names or indica or sativa in a affectionate way thus far. And it's because they mean nothing. How can I say that in the German? They mean nothing. The fact is that the genetic of the plant is interesting and important to the grower because it has to do with how the plant responds to, pests and mildew and yada, 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 how fast it grows, how fast it yields. Can you plant it underneath the tree line? The helicopter is going to see it from the sky. Yeah. Those things are very important to the majority of the growers in marijuana. But for the growers that are developing profiles or medicines for the medical marijuana community or medical cannabis community, they mean a lot less to the people who need them than they do. Those things are extremely important in the illicit market, right? Because and the crazy thing is that people can constantly draw that conclusion because cannabis has been in the illicit market for so long and controlled extensively in the illicit market that those things are so ingrained in their taxonomy that they almost get offended when you start telling people that these strains mean absolutely nothing. But the fact is that you can't show me where a strain meant something versus where the profile, the cannabinoid profile that was produced by that genetic, that was important. But the problem is the genetic was not the primary driver in that profile. Ultimately, the cultivation process was. The cultivation process is way more important to the outcome of the medicine or the medicinal profile than the genetic would be. I basically kind of like imagine if we had a map and we were to place something on the map and how we get from where we are to where we want to go on the map. That, I guess, is kind of the genetics. The fact that the map even exists and that you have efficient routes to get there and how you're going to get there, that is the environment that's tied to this. It'd be like saying that the kitchen is the most important thing in making a meal when competing with the famous TV chefs. They'd probably be able to outcook me any day of the week on a campfire, and that would probably be considered crappy genetics, unless you love campfires, versus you have a 3-star Michelin kitchen, and that would be considered great genetics. Look how stable and look how robust these are. Yeah, I'd still screw it up. I'd probably still burn toast in that particular thing, and it had nothing to do with the kitchen. It had to do with the fact that my inputs, my skills, my approach to this cultivation either is really good or really bad. And if I'm really good, it almost doesn't matter where I go. Although I can make toast. So from that, we want to be able to say, okay, out of all those possibilities, which of those profiles is most likely going to provide relief for a particular patient who has these basic issues that are driven by these root causes. We have to step over and respect certain things based on pathways and previous requirements. We have our strategy that we're going to do, and we're going to deploy a clinically matched set of profiles to their issue. We're going to do it through a very specific set of tactics and protocols that look at the deployment, the application, right, the results and dosing and all the different pieces to impact the baseline data. Because when you successfully identify an issue that is capable of being re-regulated to a homeostasis type expectation, we see significant shifts from the baseline. We see very significant shifts from the baseline. And it all is based on the fact that we listened to what the patient was doing and we started matching profiles that have shown efficacy against that consistently. Not 1 in 10,000, but we also picked 85% of the time. We're looking for profiles that are performing for populations of patients that come and basically provide data back of the grower information that they're getting with these profiles, and that they are then creating the process that allows us to have that data set that then when somebody comes in and says, hey, okay, these are the issues that we're having, and that we can say, based on your information and based on these patient information, it looks like that you have a similarity. So let's develop a strategy. Now, unfortunately, at this point, there's no way to actually administer cannabis to a patient, right? This is kind of becoming a little bit annoying. This is just a picture of what we're doing here. One of these canvases that's beginning to be filled out. The problem with cannabis as a therapy is that there is no physician that is really capable or even allowed to apply cannabis as a therapy. So what do? We have to educate the patient. We educate the patient, we educate the parent, and we get them to the level that they can legally, but also conscious competence. We're developing conscious competence in our patient population, in our parents, so that they understand what to do. It's a little bit of an intense process. In fact, it's about a 3 to 6 day intense process. But what we want is that kind of uses our mental model, is that when we go into a hospital and a nurse is administering a particular medicine, and if you were to ask him or her what the medicine is that you're giving either us or our patient, they would be able to have a conversation about it. They would have a level of conscious competence that they know what it is, how it acts, what to look for, what side effects, why they're choosing it versus something else based on the outcome that you're trying to achieve, and why they are dosing that amount. These are the core conversations that we have every day here, and this is what we're trying to develop with our patient parents and our patients, because they're the ones who have to administer. Now, we may sit with them and we can watch them and give them this education, but that's the crux of how we basically bring things together, is that it has to be with a conscious level of competence based on what's actually happening, regardless of what you hear on CNN or Facebook. Regardless of what you're hearing on these social media, trying to get a bunch of views, there is science behind all of this. We just have to kind of back up and say, you may need to take everything that you know about cannabis and just throw it away for just a little bit. And we're just going to start rebuilding. We're going to use your interest and your motivation to learn about cannabis as a way to start building those blocks, because then you can have people like Amy's question out and basically educating a group of people who need this information because they have real things at risk. And if cannabis is capable of mitigating those things, then they should not suffer those issues anymore. They should benefit from the application of science, especially when that science has been demonstrated that has no real calculatable lethality and cannot change your sensitivity to brain chemistries, i.e. chemical addiction, it would make sense that people would be investigating this as a solution before they've exhausted everything else, but that it is sometimes worthwhile to go down that path. Except I had a professor that used to always say this, and it drove us crazy until you realize that how much truth is in it. But in science, things are except for when they aren't. And it's like, oh, that is not useful at all, sir. The fact is that cannabis can't cure anything. It can't solve every problem. So the very first thing that you want to do, and that's why this canvas approach, is identify, is this even going to be a solution or a possibility for you? Because if you're not, most people who are coming to our program and who are looking at cannabis because they represent a refractory issue just need to know if they're even in the right direction. And selling people weed is not how you determine if you're in the right direction. Reconnaissance is how we get there. We get there by going forward of the issue and look to see, are we even heading in the right direction, and then validate that we are before people have to make major choices. And interestingly enough, our project has suggested that when cannabis is involved in the regulation or the supplementing of the endocannabinoid system that is involved in the regulation or is currently involved in the misregulation of their particular health issue, that the outcome should be extremely significant. Not a miracle, but it should be extremely significant and documentable and evidence-based, and usually, thus far, looks like the opposite of how the majority of, the super ultra majority of cannabis use is not how you get to those results. And that's the saddest part about it. Because I think people are taking these wonderful tools and picking their teeth with them. And as they knock out their teeth because the screwdriver was the wrong toothpick, they then turn to the person and hopefully they knock their tooth out. And then that's the kind of the camaraderie that they have. And that's unacceptable. So we've got to find a way to be able to educate past that. Okay, so that's the end of this one. Do we have any more questions? And we'll probably, at this point, most people have kind of hit their limit.
Amy says pharma meds cause toxic effects, potentially and oftentimes without ever being effective. So the parents want to remove pharma as the end goal or as many as possible. And I said correct.
Well, okay, but also, so I'm also, my background is from pharma. And I would just say that I totally and appreciate and respect what she just said, because at a high level, the result seems that's the case. But there's a couple things. One, nobody enters pharma with the intentions of harming human beings, right? There's a lot of people who dedicate their whole life. I mean, it's the same dedication to pharma development that is the dedication to this, the MX, right? Secondly, we can't discount the fact that there are always crappy employees, right? You could go to a very nice restaurant. You go to a very nice hospital. We often associate the fact that the employee that you happen to be interfacing with sucks and is not taking the time and is not doing their job correct and is basically creating a giant liability because they just are bad at their job, right? There was that joke. I don't know. I can't attribute it to you, but somebody that looks a lot like Don may have said a joke. Do you know what you call somebody? Should I say the joke?
Yeah.
Do you know what you call somebody who graduated last in medical school? And the answer was doctor. There are great doctors out there, obviously, bazillions of them, but it doesn't necessarily mean that people, I mean, we deal with a lot of patients and it's almost like it's not the very first problem that most people are running into is that they're dealing with an incompetent human being on their issue. And so the problem, I think, with a lot of refractory patient situations is that because nothing works, ultimately it creates that makes it somehow like by default okay to not receive help. And then when all of a sudden somebody stands up, because there's all these moms and dads that stand up, they get shut down. And it's this, what you're really dealing with is people that should not maybe be your resource. So I don't know. I guess not all pharma is bad. A lot of it is misused because the people who are applying it are incompetent. So what you just have to do is demand. And even in the cannabis world, I mean, think about how many people are being sold pounds of cannabis, grams and grams and grams of cannabis oil that's not doing anything, yet $6,000 a time, or using those people to make lots and lots of money, not based on results. It's the same Peter principle, right? But it exists everywhere. As parents who have people that are worth fighting for, I guess the big thing is just fight for them. Whether it's cannabis, whether it's medicine, whatever, if it's unacceptable, then just keep driving and
Demand more.
Demand more.
Demand more.
Demand more. Yep. I appreciate Amy's sentiment.
She has 5 more questions. She's typing, I think.
It's pretty awesome.
Luann, do you have any questions?
It's like, I don't know either. But so if there was anybody we could hear, I could hear him through this thing right here.
No hearing.
No hearing. I mean, I can hear everything except I can't. So
would you like me to call you guys? We can talk on the phone. Maybe we can conference call the 3 of us.
I think they can't hear us. I mean, or maybe they can hear us, but we can't hear them.
Can you do a little typey type and see if
there's a, let me try this again. There's a, right?
Amy says she doesn't see that button, but
Right.
she's using the YouTube version, I think, of.
Oh,
She asked.
oh, the YouTube version. Oh, she's watching it from YouTube.
I think so.
Yeah, there is some way of doing that. Unfortunately, I think I thought I recorded there. Wow, this is going to be like, if you guys kindergartners I'm kindergartners of Google Hangouts. I will definitely. This is not a core competence. I am consciously incompetent when it comes to this stuff. So there's a chat.
Leanne says she can hear us. Awesome, Leanne.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Luann. Amy, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Oh, when you look at this cannabinoid methodology in relation to cancer diagnosis, where does this come into play in helping prevent chemo as a first line of treatment?
Okay.
Good question.
Good question. So ultimately, each patient is different. Each patient is different, obviously, because of the stage, because of the aggression, so all of the factors that go into assessing the cannabis cancer. So we would basically apply the same method, because one of those protocols would be sometimes based on what we know about cannabis and cannabinoid, and really the dissemination of the molecules into the cancer cells themselves. What we want to know and what we're trying to figure out is how fast is it going? Because if you have a mass, right? So you've got a mass of, I'm just going to pick a number, but of a million cells, and those cells are doubling every some period of time. So I'm just going to call that every 3 days. So you go from 1 million to 2 million. Okay. So if the cannabinoid therapy is capable of achieving what people call apoptosis, which I would argue is maybe not quite the most effective mechanism, but we won't get into that right now. The point being is, let's say it can achieve 200,000 cells are eliminated, but you went from 1 million to 1.6 million cells when you killed 200, right? So then what you're going to do is then you're going to kill another 200, or you're going to address. Now, obviously, in certain cases, people have been very successful in their application of cannabinoid therapy, where they have not necessarily needed to seek chemotherapy. So on the other end of the spectrum, where you can't physically access the tumor fast enough, there is other scenarios where you might be able to, or you even have the time to experiment to find out. So it would all go on the canvas. Like, all those things that you had to be wary of, and the issues and protocols and mitigated things, and that all goes on there because that goes into developing that plan. By the way, your chemotherapy could go into that plan, right? The medicines that you're using could be going to that plan. I mean, actually, Tylenol could go onto that plan. You could put, I have a headache, and what's it being caused by? Is it inflammation, or is it neuropathy, or is it all these different things, right? I mean, that's kind of a weird thing to have as a headache. But the point being is that you put it up there, you put your issues, it used to be worse, or it's now getting worse, or whatever it is. The reason why it's happening, the pathway that's there, we would pick. I mean, when somebody comes to with a headache, we run them through the exact same process.
Got it.
It's a protocol that doesn't care what cannabis you use, as long as it's the right cannabis.
Can you explain to them that you've gone out and you've researched all these different profiles of cannabis, and you've documented over time, probably the last 6 years, 5 years, what each profile can accomplish? And based on the accomplishments of those profiles determines how we set them up with the illness process or whatever the issues at hand are.
So this is not a setup question.
Okay.
But so people want to know, like, what we document with so each strain kind of goes through a process of, we just call it the thesis, right? So it's just basically it's an assessment of the path. So there's this is that logistical supply chain that basically, when you're dealing with a cannabis that is not working, even though it could technically work, then the problem is with your supply chain logistics. Like, every person that's been involved to get to, something that you're using, that something has been resultant from everything that has happened prior to that. Selection, environment, processing, everything. That's what's broken, not your issue. And so in order to be able to it's not control, but to manage, so that supply chain brings you the solution that you need, right? So you basically have this piece that's here that you're looking for. And the reason why it's here that you can even access it is because all these other things happened. So when we're dealing with bringing people to their solutions, we have to back up and say, look, your genetic source is not necessarily as important as everybody thinks it is, but it does have to stay the same, because then we have to expose it to the exact same inputs, the exact same environments, the exact same processes to be able to get the exact same profile. There's a curing process. There's a lot of things that are going on in there. But as you move that forward, then it can enter into what's called like a clinical data collection system, basically like a double-blind study looking for efficacy, where we'll use a patient pool of at least 200 to identify those major, basically a therapeutic index based on the clinical data collected from those patients. That then goes into a living data set, because it's constantly validating itself, right? It's becoming more accurate with more data that it is, that then can be deployed to somebody who needs specific sets of therapy that have been demonstrated in that larger pool. So that's called the DERP. And so the DERP is the end of the road for a managed pipeline of agriculture production, goes to the DERP, turns into a data set. That data set then is available for in this particular case would be like our MOCO patients, which is the observational clinic patients. And then they draw from the DERP data, the drug effectiveness data, that ultimately allow us to be able to find those matches, but then gets fine-tuned through the canvas.
Amy's question is, so in the end,
Yes.
SAR, small active molecule.
Nice.
So is the end SAR, small active molecule, a true botanical or a synthetic product?
Man. Okay.
Good.
She's good. She's awesome, because she's asking, like, maybe we should have her like on all of our calls. Okay. So it's both, because a synthetic molecule and a naturally derived molecule is just synthetically derived on the plant. But I like to invoke the vitamin E metaphor here, because what she's asking is that, is an apple the same as an apple? Yes. Where the apple came from ultimately is the same. Now, moralistically or whatever that part of it is, that's a whole different thing. But the fact is if you could create an apple in a laboratory, you would create the exact same apple that's on the tree. The same processes happen. But there are other things like in vitamin E. Why doesn't synthetic vitamin E work hardly at all versus naturally extracted vitamin E? It's not because the vitamin E molecule is any different. It's because the other things that it coexist, that in the development of this oil that, go back to evolutionary theory. So this oil is here because that fish provides this thing, and then there's these things that need that, and it basically is co-developed all these synergistic systems. One of the reasons that synthetically derived materials are less effective is because sometimes the helpers that are necessary are not there. But the other thing is that by classifying cannabinoids, she asked a really good question here. By classifying cannabinoids by their FOB and not by their function, you allow pharmaceutical companies to create THCs. You know them as bath salts or the spice epidemic. When you methylate THC, you've created a THC, but it's a laboratory developed THC that was never designed or synergistically developed or never meant for your endocannabinoid system, yet it has a binding affinity of 1,000x. And you end up having these really weird psychotic episodes because you just took the worst of THC, man augmented it. It's not the same. It's not an apple anymore. It's an apple with a poison pill stuck next to it. One of the things I think when you're talking about biopharma right now, the people that are doing some of these CBD trials, is that one of the things that I would be looking at is, are they basically methylating CBD? Because CBD doesn't have an affinity for the neuron nor the immune system receptors. And so now you're not talking about a one-to-one with the missing things in the vitamin E conversation. Now you're talking about people who can slip things in under the guise of the name of the FOB with a barb, for lack of a better word, but a single methylated, it's methylated. And ultimately that creates an abnormal binding, and that is where the liability I think is going to come. But because nobody knows anything about cannabis and everybody keeps calling it CBD, it would be just like if somebody started calling stuff we're just going to give you stuff, poisonous stuff or good stuff. Stuff, come on, you eat stuff, you want stuff. And now that's obviously ridiculous, but I'm just saying that that's the anyway, that's a great question. She just opened up a very interesting answer.
Does the methodology support that flavonoids and terpenes have therapeutic effects, i.e. aroma also has physical effects on the body?
So what she's saying, okay, is that Amy again?
Yes, it's Amy.
All right. That's pretty right. Okay, good.
Would it help if you saw what she wrote?
No. I just like her questions. So they are there. If you were going to source cannabis for those things, you might, versus comparison to other places. Like for example, mycene is a terpenoid that it's been shown possibly to help administer materials across the blood-brain barrier. But if you were going to do that, then you should just eat thyme, because 40% by weight is that mycene, is that terpenoid. Or you should just go out and lick pitch off of a tree, because if that's what you want, then you should just go to those sources that have these much higher. As far as aromatherapy goes, I don't know anything about aromatherapy.
I think she's using it as an example.
Oh yeah. I just know that there's been a study that says if you stand for 15 minutes a day in the Superman pose, you stimulate your adrenal system. And if you're going to take the IQ test or you're going to go do something that really matters, by standing like Superman, with the hips, right, for 15 minutes a day, I think it was a Stanford study, although I can't source it directly, but because I wouldn't, but it's out there, is that feeling good obviously has a massive impact on the effectiveness of things. So that's one of the reasons why we left all of the physical attributes off the M scale, which is a summary of what cannabis can do. That's why we built the M scale, was a timeline with the And the discrete effects looks like a periodic table with a numeric line. It just says, look, if you want cannabis to do something, it needs to fall within these things. Initially, we had left off all of the physical stuff. The point being is that is important to patients for the use of their medicine, for the consistent applications. And so we put down some small descriptors simply for usability, because there's a lot of those aspects that helps people continue to use their therapy that you can't discount. Because if they're not using their therapy, then those things do matter if it matters to them. And I don't know anything about that subject, so I am not the person to talk to about as far as the flavonoids and the aromatherapy. I just don't know anything about that stuff.
Does that help, Amy?
We can't hear her, so
yeah,
okay.
Awesome. Woo.
Well then,
she has more questions. Hold on, she's typing. Aren't you? Are you typing, Amy? Luann says Amy is very knowledgeable.
Amy is very knowledgeable. I like her questions, that she's not just asking yes or no. She's really opening up, like some good discussion. Like I would really love to have like somehow where we could actually hear and see each other. Mm-hmm. Yeah, somebody should come up with that technology that you can actually use.
Was this helpful, ladies?
Okay.
Are they still on? It says
I think
two
there's
viewers.
two. Yeah, there's two. So, well, why don't we just do this? We'll just assume that we pretty much finished out. We'll follow up with everybody. And then we can also maybe do a better practice run, because I would really like to incorporate, like, the level of the types of questions that she's bringing up are so useful, right? So let's, we'll figure out how to get it done. I'm just ignorant on this particular technology. I only know how to turn it on. That's it.
Okay.
So, okay. All right. Well, then, thanks everybody. Sorry that I'm not the world's best person doing these things, but we'll figure it out. We'll get better. All right.
Hold on. Wait. Did I hear you say that you do offer different delivery methods for your end product?
Yes.
Yes.
We have to, because of the requirements for. The big question is that through the processing, if you put it through the digestive process, and it's not bioavailable, so like this whole idea of co-processing, I would argue that you're basically destroying a good deal of this, because by the time it makes it to the lumens of the intestine, you basically subjected things to stuff, and so you can't ensure that the profile remains the same. So ultimately, we need to pre-activate and make it pre-available, and then ultimately deliver it in the most effective way possible. Obviously, inhalation is one of those ways. I would say that under the tongue sublingually is kind of a farce, because it goes away. Like, it just basically, you swallow it. The saliva production makes sublingual applications like not functionally true. But we still would be looking at whatever the delivery system, to include, there are certain profiles that you cannot eat because the cannabinoids don't make it. Not all of them, some of them. So that's what we have to look. That's why the lean canvas, right? So we may have to go back and adjust, and that's why it's learning. Each iterative, as you do this through those tactics, and we can get in more details. There's actually we have some things that are get down to the nitty gritty. Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, 6 hours here, 6 hours there. Now all that gets laid out. When people are here, we basically
This is a high overview of.
Yeah. But we want to have a path, because no matter what we can do, we can recreate it. Because if we accidentally stumble upon something that's wonderful, we absolutely need to go back and do it. It cannot be by accident that we stumbled across it. It has to be done by a method.
Amy says, yes, I understand more about your company now, and this has been very informative.
Awesome. Well,
good job.
That's a good question, asker.
She's good.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. We're with MX. We're trying not to toot our own horn, but we are here because we care about our patients, and we don't sign up to sell anyone weed. We don't have any weed to sell them. We sign up to help you. And so when we're working with patients, that's how we know we end up meeting our objective, is we outline how we are going to be able to help you, how you're going to be able to measure that help. And that's what we that's what we engage with, is that we're a good fit with people who we can benefit. And our very first obligation is to figure out if we can't benefit you, because we don't want you wasting your time with us or anyone. But if we can, then you're going to see a lot of me. So hopefully you guys dig it. All right. Thanks, everybody. I'll talk to you later.